foreigners are selling US Treasuries. Why? Is it because they don't like the way the government is spending its money? Is it a sign of some geopolitical intrigue? What does the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s have to do with it all? We're going to talk about all of that next. But first, ladies and gentlemen, if this was a professional show, what we would do right now is we would segue to a very fancy video graphic with people maniacally ringing the stock exchange bell, ticker symbols going rapidly across the bottom, and then we would have pictures of birds like hawks and doves and ostriches and peacocks, and then to rope the men in, we would have ladies jumping on trampolines, and then we would cut to a scowling Jay Powell. To rope in the ladies, we would have gentlemen in speedos jumping on a trampoline, and then we would cut to a bemused US Treasury Secretary Yellen face. And then finally, we would have an announcer with a deep voice come on and say something compelling with fireworks and lasers. And then at the end, an explosion. And then we would fade back in to me throwing it to the head of global research for Alhambra Partners. And I would say he's broadcasting deep from within the shadows of the monetary system, Jeff Snider. So I want you all to imagine that that's what happened. Jeff? Welcome to the show. I
don't think I want any of that, Emil. I think I'm more than happy with you describing it and painting that picture, because I think it's so much better than cheesy B-roll graphics going across. I think your expressions and the way you sell it are far superior to expensive graphics. And I'm saying that as our video production department says, yeah, we don't have the budget for any of that.
We are going to, ladies and gentlemen, all seriousness, I wrote this at the end. Jeff, this is your best ever explanation of why foreigners are selling US Treasuries and why it's not some geopolitical apocalypse or sign of imminent bankruptcy. Ladies and gentlemen, this article is one of the best that Jeff has written on this topic in forever. I think it's fantastic. You're going to want to hear and read it yourself. It's called Yet Another Key Warning Sign, Piece of Strong Evidence, Tick, and the Long Misunderstood History of Selling Treasuries. That's the key, the long misunderstood history. We're going to talk about it. We're going to start with the Asian financial crisis, which, Jeff, you say was a regional dollar shortage that maybe it was a prequel to what would be the global financial crisis.
I wouldn't say maybe. I would say that it was in every way. I mean, yeah, people can argue with that all. And I think the reason that there might be any controversy to that, making that assertion at all, is it just starts with a name, right? The Asian financial crisis doesn't sound like regional dollar shortage. I mean, Asia is a region, but it's a financial crisis, right? But when you actually look at the nuts and bolts of what happened, it was a dollar shortage up and down that side of the Pacific, even from the very first with Thailand. Thailand started experiencing a massive dollar shortage that simply spread like a virus, like the flu. That's why, I like to call it the Asian flu, because it spread like a virus from one place to another. And most famously, it took down the quote unquote Asian tiger economies like Thailand and others associated with it. But really, its worst parts took place in Tokyo and in Japan.
People don't know that, Jeff.
I know.
They don't know that.
Well, because Japan is, the history of Japan is mostly tied up into earlier in the decade, right? Japan was already in a depression. Therefore, what did the Asian financial crisis have to do with Japan? And what happened was 97, 98 in Japan was like 1937 and 1938 was in the United States Great Depression. It was the depression within the depression. When you look at a lot of different accounts, a lot of different ways, 97 and 98 was worse from Japan than it had been in 91 and 92. It was that sort of knockout blow that said, you're down for the count, you're never getting back up. So the Asian financial crisis for Japan was absolutely consequential, and that's where most of the big activity centered around. The 97, yeah, that was the initial Thailand and some of the smaller economies, but when you get into the real big trouble, and this includes the Russian crisis too, that went along the same way, that was the where it really got to be serious, and then eventually led to LTCM in the United States. That was the 98 episode where Japan was in the thick of all of it.
Incredible. Incredible. I think we could make an analogy to 2008, where everyone thinks it's about the mortgage-backed securities. like
Yeah.
they think 98 was about the Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth, when really in 2008, the story was the monetary system, the banks in Lombard and Wall Street. That was the crisis, just like the monetary center in 1998. Japan was the crisis, and you bring out one tangible example for us to hold on to. Tell us the story about the Bank of Tokyo-Mitsubishi and Barclays and the spread between the two as signal of how deep in the S Japan was.
Well, I mean, we think of money market rates as single rates, and therefore we think the money markets are monolithic. There's just, hey, the LIBOR, 3 months LIBOR is X. That means everybody's borrowing at X. No, 3 months, LIBOR, like federal funds, the effective federal funds rate, they're an amalgamation. They're a calculation of individual transactions that can take place all over. So what LIBOR is an own rate, which is the people back then, the banks that were participating in the British Bankers Association survey would say, this is what I could borrow unsecured in these interbank Eurodollar markets. And for a bank like Barclays, they got closer to the average because it's Barclays. There was no
British.
trouble in 1998. The British part of the very well steeped in the Eurodollar inner workings, so no credit risk, no material risk whatsoever. However, Bank of Mitsubishi Tokyo and some of the other Japanese banks,
Bank of Tokyo-Mitsubishi, that was a very tiny, out of the way, no one's ever heard of a bank, right, Jeff?
Yeah, no.
That was the
Not at all.
That was it.
Not at all. This was the supreme, the creme de la creme of Japanese banks.
Okay.
What they were saying is, here's this best bank in Japan. What would it be able to borrow over in U.S. dollars over LIBOR? And the answer was an enormous. It got up to be 110 or so
Yes.
spread over LIBOR, which is absolutely huge. And this was the best of Japanese banks. So what we know from those spreads alone is that Japanese banks were having an enormous enormous problem securing U.S. dollars in offshore markets. And if it was 110 spread for BOTM, what was it for banks further down the tier? Banks lower credit quality, lower reputational score, those things like that. They were definitely paying some multiple of that premium over LIBOR, which meant really serious problem with dollar shortage.
Now we're going to get to what other banks around the world did, and then how they were kind of limited in helping Japan. But I want to take a quick tangent, because you do in your paper here regarding the Federal Reserve helping Japan. But Jeff, I've got to draw attention to this. This is very unusual. And in my mind, I think if we were to line up all the people in the world in a single line in descending order, ranked on number of hours read, FOMC statements read, right? I would say, Jeff, that you would be very, very, very close to the front of that line. And Jeff,
I think that's kind of a dubious.
I'm damning you with faint praise.
Yeah, and I feel damned.
But for our purposes here, you have read all these statements. Jeff, how frequently do you see segments of the meeting minutes redacted about very important things, like how much did the Federal Reserve give to Japan to help them during this crisis? Tell this fascinating little nugget morsel.
I have never run across it again.
Wow.
To be honest with you. So it's extremely rare. And when we're talking about redacted amounts, never seen it. Never seen that before. And it's weird. And I know this is 25, almost a quarter century ago, and maybe it doesn't seem like a big deal. But to me, when you're trying to piece together what's going on in the just the Asian financial crisis and seeing what everybody knew about this dollar problem back then, because that was an important issue, as we found out in August of 2007. What we really want to know is, how did as we talked about in the last segment, how do all of these things fit together? And that's why I read these transcripts, because you don't get, the mainstream media is no help. Academic papers, forget it. They're absolutely worthless on these kinds of things. You really have to go to the primary source material and dig through it. As tedious and as unrewarding as that is to listen to these idiots go on and on about things that don't matter, occasionally you arrive at something that makes you go, okay, I've got something here. This Asian financial crisis, And I don't want to get too much into the details of specifically what's going on here, because that'll just take us in a different direction. But by and large, Bank of Japan was having, obviously they knew their local banks were having major dollar issues, and they knocked on the door of the Federal Reserve and said, we got to have some help here, because our banks are really struggling to secure dollars. Give us something. And what they came up with this sort of quasi-repo swap kind of arrangement, but we have no idea. The amounts of those arrangements, the terms of those arrangements are redacted from the transcript. This is a public transcript, that everything is supposed to be made public. And to this day, I haven't checked in a couple of years, and maybe the amounts have magically shown up, but I doubt it. Why were those redacted? And I think the answer is they never want anybody to know just how big of a problem this was. And I think up until the point when this is early 1998, when this is going on, they really thought, well, we can keep this under control and it won't be a big deal. And then when it did become a big deal, they wanted to keep it under wraps because they didn't want people to know that it was a big deal before it became a big deal. And of course, then it became an even bigger deal a decade later when the whole thing fell apart. So, I don't want to be conspiratorial here. There's obviously some reason. I'm sure they could provide you with a reason. Maybe file a Freedom of Information Access request. I don't know, but it's the only time I've ever seen amounts redacted, which in the context of our discussion here suggests this was serious dollar issues that even the Fed was not willing to share all the details of what they were doing behind the scenes.
And then you continue with your story saying that U.S. money dealers did what they were supposed to, charge higher and higher premium to lend, but then did lend happily. But at a certain point, the lenders were prohibited by their risk departments from lending any further. And you offer a quote here from FOMC statement from Mr. Peter Fisher. And then you point out, okay, a dollar shortage. And, okay, so money dealers offering money, but
you're
then
a dealer,
they're
right?
limited out.
You've got free spare cash, you've got dollars, you can create dollars if you want to. You've seen these banks in Japan, they're struggling, rates that they're being charged, that they're willing to pay go up and up and up. You're thinking, cha-ching. These guys are paying 110 basis points over LIBOR. Their neighbor's paying 125. There's other banks that are willing to pay 200 over LIBOR. I'm going to make my year here. So the lending desks are, I'm going to lend as much as I possibly can because that's my sole job. That's how banks work. The lending desk says, I'm going to lend because these prices are so favorable. I can't make anywhere near this kind of return anywhere else. But other parts of the same banks are going, whoa, pump the brakes here. You can make your bank, but I'm responsible for you, and you're getting involved with these banks that are paying way over LIBOR for a reason. There's a reason why the market is saying you have to pay a premium, and we're gonna rein you in here. You want to lend at even higher spreads, but we're telling you, hold on a second. We need to reassess the situation and see if you can lend. In fact, some of those banks that were lending dollars to their Japanese counterparts were running it up against these pre-existing credit limits that triggered all sorts of these other review processes. And when those review processes were completed, they were like, no more lending to Japan. I don't care if it's a 500 basis point spread. These people are dangerous. So as the rate rose, the dollar rates that were being charged to the bank, these Japanese banks rose. In the initial part, late 97, early 98, they were still getting the dollars they needed. They were just paying exorbitant premiums to do so. Around April and May of 1998, that's when the reviews started to get triggered. And all of a sudden, it didn't matter what rate the banks were willing to pay. They couldn't secure dollars at any price, which, again, that should sound familiar to anybody who's paid attention to August 2007 forward. It didn't matter what rate that went up to. Banks got shut out of the dollar markets because of these various reasons, the same kinds of reasons. Dollar shortage.
And then the Bank of Japan decided to help the situation out. Now, I don't remember at that particular time there being a lot of stories about the Bank of Japan sending a geopolitical message to the United States that they were selling US Treasuries because of some
They hated Bill Clinton, right? They were upset about the impeachment or something.
Yeah, I think that was it. Or
even though that was a year later, I mean, they were upset about the fact that Clinton was going to be impeached.
I'm making light of the situation, but I shouldn't. Jeff, What did the Bank of Japan do to save its internal banking system? It raised funds. How?
It did what it always did. And that's what I was talking about in the title of the article. The selling treasuries to pay off Eurodollar shortages it's not something that we just see. We talked about it almost exclusively over the last half decade or so, because that's when it's become heavy. But this is a history and a correlation that goes back into the 1960s and the earliest days of the Eurodollar market. So the Bank of Japan, which had been doing this since the 1960s, when confronted with a local dollar problem at any one of its own banks, or in this case, all of its own banks, they started selling. They liquidated reserve assets in order to raise funds so that they could extricate their local banks from their dollar problems. And that it didn't establish this correlation between foreigners selling treasuries and dollar shortage. It continued that history, which was already by then decades old. So foreigners, as you say, foreigners are not selling treasuries because they hate America or they think the Fed is printing money and the dollar is going to crash. They're doing it for essentially the opposite reason, that dollar shortage, inelasticity. And at that time, of course, we saw the dollar rising, which is another signal. So all of these things together tell us dollar problem, dollar shortage that's becoming so bad, it actually shows up in a number of different ways, including FOMC transcripts with redacted amounts.
And it shows up in the Treasury International Capital report, which I am pulling up right now, a graph, data that you pulled from that report. And there's a big red circle on this graph. Jeff, tell us both what the there are two graphs here, total buying of long-term domestic securities and then total private buying of long-term domestic securities. Why the difference, and then what's that big red circle pointing to?
Well, first of all, the total buying includes both private banks and overseas, private entities, as well as official. And official is central banks and governments. Okay. So we have total, which includes both buckets and what their activities. And what the tick data shows you, and what we're seeing here, is essentially, there's trillions of U.S. dollar assets bought, and there's trillions of U.S. dollar assets sold in any given month, but there's usually more of one than the other. In the build-up dollar, as you can see here, there's typically more buying than selling because there's more excess dollars outside the U.S. that end up coming back into the U.S. Or what Ben Bernanke was forced to call a global savings glut before that idea ridiculously blew up in his face. There's more dollars outside the United States that end up being purchased in domestic assets or being used to purchase domestic assets. And as you can see, between 98 and 2007, that really got into overdrive. I mean, it went insane levels of foreigners purchasing, especially U.S. Treasuries, which is what triggered Ben Bernanke's global savings glut nonsense, essentially because the Eurodollar system went nuts itself. So we have monetary expansion clearly indicated by what's going on in the net tick figures. You want to go back up to the top one, I'll explain 97, 98, which is total. You see how rare it was, especially in this later period, for there to be any month where there's more selling than buying. And primarily U.S. Treasuries, but not just U.S. Treasuries. And in the case of the actual outright selling, it usually is U.S. Treasuries. So what we're seeing is May 1998, we have the FOMC discussion where Peter Fisher, who was the open market manager, said, banks are saying they're shutting the door on Japan. May 1998. From May 1998 until August and September, remember September 1998, that was LTCM's failure and a bunch of other, that's where the Asian financial crisis got to be its worst. So we see in the tick data where we have lots of net buying up until that point, except for that 1 month in 1997, where suddenly net buying across the entire world becomes net selling. And that net selling isn't, again, Japanese selling treasuries because they hate Bill Clinton or what's going on with Bill Clinton. It's because they're faced with a dollar shortage. And this is a consistent pattern that doesn't just pertain to 1997, 98. We also saw it in the 1960s, and not just one specific instance where the Japanese government was selling T-bills to fill in a $200 million hole that these Japanese banks had in the Eurodollar market from its earliest days in the 60s. We see it more consistently since 2014, but even in specific episodes from August 2007 forward.
And Jeff, there's a line in your report here, so I hope the audience doesn't think I'm being rude. What point am I trying to make here? You wrote that in your paper. I'm not being rude. The point is this big red arrow at the far right of the graph, Jeff, and it says May 2021. The latest data came in, and that line, well, it's on the wrong side of zero, Jeff.
Not just on the wrong side of zero, but it's one of the, if you look at the entire chart, it's one of the lowest in the history. So what you're seeing is reflation, dollar flood, Jay Powell, all this nonsense about too much cash, overabundance, all that kind of stuff. How the hell do we have such a big negative in tick when this tick data and what it indicates and what the implications are for the opposite of all those things? And remember, we don't care about Jay Powell's opinion about the domestic dollar system, because that's looking at us one small slice of the overall whole. We want to know what's going on in the entire monetary system, because if there's a problem offshore, even if it hasn't shown up in Jay Powell's window yet, an offshore problem eventually will. And then unfortunately, this big negative in tick, where we see selling of assets indicative of a dollar shortage, has been corroborated and correlated with all number of other indications all across real-time markets and data that we've been talking about consistently since it happened. And more than that, though, as we're seeing recently, May 2021 keeps coming up in a lot of these places. We see, for example, in June, following this big warning, this big dollar warning in the tick data, it was in June where we saw global bond yields really start to fall. So, again, going back to what you said in the earlier segment, we have a shadow money system that we can't directly observe. So we're trying to piece together not just a small number of, esoteric indications, but a wide survey of all of these things that see if we can't get a consistent picture. And what the picture that we're finding is that, it's not the one we want. It's not an overabundance of money. There's a problem here, and a growing problem that we've seen way too many times before.
Last week I asked David Parkins, our illustrator, to draw a seismograph and to label each of the little rumbles we've had with these monetary disturbances. But I asked him not to create, some sort of apoplectic Hollywood movie 10.0 kind of explosion yet, because we're not there yet. And that's the point you make at the very end of your report. You say, it does not indicate that a crisis is right around the corner. Rather, it is yet another strong piece of evidence which strongly suggests the world is and has been heading down the wrong path. And then, Jeff, I imagine that you left and then thought about it, and you came back, and then you added at the very end, again.
I think, in some ways mentally that's true, because you have to say again. But, I think that's the point we want to make here. Let's not go too far with this stuff. We're not saying that we're, it's August 2007 again, and right over, right across the horizon is going to be massive financial crisis or anything like that. What we're saying is we're seeing these piled ups of warnings that are indicative of a system going in the wrong way, and that if it continues to go the wrong way, we expect we'll see more, more clearer warnings, deeper warnings, more serious warnings that will tell you that what we have now is a system that isn't necessarily in a critical state, but it is in a precarious state. Our perfect example last week of the scramble for collateral, for example. Why didn't that lead to something more serious? And the reason was because we're not in a more serious or more weakened condition. It's in a fragile condition, but it's not in a crisis condition. And that's really what we're focusing on now is, okay, we're seeing, it's like you're in a building that looks like it's a little shaky. You can hear the creaks and you can hear the cracks, and you maybe see a little, crack on the wall, but it isn't like the thing's going to fall down tomorrow. We don't know that just yet. And there's time for somebody to come along and fix things before it does. So what we're saying here is that we have the predicate conditions for something worse, but we're not into that place yet. All of these bad warning signs they're piling up, and we're moving in the wrong direction, but we're not too far down that road.
My preferred metaphor, the one you just did, is a little bit more melodramatic, and I'm thinking of the China syndrome. And so I always like to think of it, yeah, nothing's wrong yet, but the pipes are rattling. You're in the nuclear power plant and the pipes are rattling funny, and then the steam's coming out of one of the pipes. Anyways, that was a good movie. Did you ever see that one, Jeff?
Yeah, I saw that one.
It was good. It was good.
I think the best part about it was that it was so well timed. You know, I think it came out a week or so after 3 Mile Island. You couldn't have planned it better.
Conspiracy. Did Hollywood make 3 Mile Island happen? We're going to talk about it next. We're also going to talk about in part 3 that the National Bureau of Economic Research has pronounced that America went through its shortest recession ever last year. Well, we're going to tell you that maybe it really wasn't a recession at all, much like how 2008 may not have been a recession at all either. And then to rope in the men to the show, no, the ladies. I guess I messed it up. Damn it.
Oh, you were doing good.
The ladies. Ah, oh, damn it. All right, ladies and gentlemen. God, GDFMF. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the Asian financial crisis. Let's talk about it. The Asian financial crisis.
I think you should go back and cut in yourself saying ladies and finish your thought, because I want to know what the hell you were going with.
All right, I'll start over then.
No, don't start over. Just, cut in. You were going to say to rope in the ladies.
To rope in the ladies,